There is a version of the Vietnam War that most people carry around in their heads. It involves a misunderstood conflict, a misinformed public, and a generation of soldiers betrayed by politicians who could not see what those men saw every day from the ground. That version is comfortable in its own way. It places the failure somewhere external, somewhere above the men who fought and the men who sent them, in the fog of policy and the confusion of ideology. But the reality that lived inside the barracks, that moved through base camps and forward operating positions and the cramped interiors of armored personnel carriers, was not a story about misunderstanding. It was a story about misrepresentation, deliberate, systematic, and sustained misrepresentation. And the difference between those two words matters more than most histories of the war have been willing to admit. Misunderstanding implies that clarity was available and simply not reached. Misrepresentation means that clarity existed, was seen, was felt, and was then quietly set aside in favor of something more useful. What was more useful, for most of the war's duration, was the appearance of progress. Progress was the product the military machine needed to sell upward through the chain of command, and downward to a public that was beginning to lose patience, and sideways to allies who were beginning to lose confidence, and inward to soldiers who were already losing something harder to name. The war in Vietnam lasted, in its most active American phase, from roughly the early 1960s through the final withdrawal in 1975. In those years, more than 2.5 million Americans served. Approximately 58,000 did not come home. Those are the numbers that tend to anchor any discussion of the war in the United States, and they are real numbers worth holding on to. But the war also produced a second set of numbers, a parallel accounting that ran alongside the official record and said something entirely different about what was happening. That second set of numbers was not kept in any single archive. It lived in letters that soldiers wrote and then censored themselves before mailing. It lived in conversations that happened after midnight in bunkers and never made it into any after-action report. It lived in the space between what a commander wrote in his field report and what he said to the man sleeping next to him. The body count was the defining metric of the Vietnam War in a way that no single measurement had defined any previous American conflict. It was not invented as a lie. It began as a practical attempt to measure progress in a war that had no front lines, no territory to capture and hold in any conventional sense, no city to liberate or flag to plant on a hilltop that would mean the campaign was won. Without those traditional markers of military success, someone in the early years of American escalation decided that the most honest available measure was the number of enemy dead. If the enemy was being killed faster than it could replace itself, then the war was being won. The logic was not absurd on its face. It had a certain statistical clarity. What the logic could not account for was what happened when the measurement became more important than the reality it was supposed to reflect. And it happened quickly. By the mid-1960s, the body count had migrated from a tool of analysis into a tool of career advancement. A unit that produced high counts attracted favorable attention. A commander who reported consistently strong numbers moved up. A unit whose counts were modest or whose reports were cautious found itself passed over, reassigned, quietly sidelined. The incentive was never stated directly because it did not need to be. It moved through the institution the way most institutional incentives do, not through orders or written policies, but through observation. Soldiers and officers watched what happened to the people ahead of them in the hierarchy, and they adjusted. The adjustments were not always dramatic. Sometimes they were as simple as counting twice, or counting broadly. A body that could not be clearly identified was counted as enemy. Dead civilians in a free-fire zone were counted as enemy. Men killed during a retreat who turned out to be regional militia with no clear affiliation were counted as enemy. In some units, the practice evolved further. If a patrol made contact, and the contact lasted long enough to produce any casualties on either side, the resulting dead were counted favorably regardless of who they were. In the most extreme cases, which were not as rare as the official record suggests, the count was simply invented. Numbers were added to reports because the alternative, a patrol that made contact and produced nothing countable, was read within the institutional logic of the war as a patrol that had failed. What this produced over years of accumulation was a statistical portrait of a war being won that bore no reliable relationship to what was actually happening in the field. By 1967, some analysts within the intelligence community were already raising concerns about the validity of the counts. A prolonged and largely internal dispute over enemy troop strength estimates, which eventually became public through congressional hearings and journalistic investigations, revealed that different agencies were working with wildly incompatible numbers. The military was insisting that enemy strength was declining. The CIA's analysis suggested it was not. The argument was not resolved through evidence. It was resolved through authority, and the lower numbers, the ones that supported the narrative of progress, were the ones that went forward. The soldiers who were living inside this system did not need access to classified intelligence estimates to understand what was happening. They understood it through repetition and through the specific texture of daily experience. A unit would sweep through a village, take fire, return fire, report a kill. The next week, the same unit would sweep through the same village, take fire from the same positions, and report the same result. The terrain did not change. The enemy did not thin out. The report said progress was being made. The ground said otherwise. And somewhere in the gap between those two realities, soldiers developed a particular kind of cognitive adjustment that was not quite cynicism and not quite despair, but something more corrosive than either. A learned understanding that the official version of events was a separate phenomenon from events themselves. This understanding did not stay clean. It spread. Once a soldier understood that the reports his unit filed were more about institutional performance than about accurate description, he began to apply that same skepticism in every direction. Orders started to be read differently. Missions that had been explained in terms of tactical objectives began to seem more like performances staged for the benefit of commanders who needed something to report. And when missions were performances rather than genuine military operations, the question of how to survive them changed shape entirely. Survival in a performance meant not getting killed during the time the performance was being staged. It did not necessarily mean accomplishing the stated objective, because the stated objective was not necessarily real. This is where the practice that became known as search and avoid emerged. It was not a formal strategy. It had no doctrine attached to it. It was a grassroots adaptation, discovered independently by different units in different sectors, that amounted to a quiet negotiation between the requirement to go out and the requirement to come back. A patrol ordered to search a particular area might spend the required amount of time in the field, move through terrain that kept it away from the most dangerous zones, and return with a report that described the mission as completed without significant contact. The report was not a lie in any simple sense. The patrol had gone out. It had returned. It had moved through an area. Whether it had genuinely searched the areas it was supposed to search was a question the report did not make easy to answer, and nobody above a certain level in the chain of command was asking it very hard. The soldiers who participated in search and avoid operations were not cowards in any meaningful sense of that word. Many of them had already demonstrated extraordinary courage in situations where they had no choice but to fight. What they were doing when they practiced search and avoid was applying a rational calculus to an irrational situation. They had understood that the mission they were being sent on was not designed to produce a genuine military outcome. It was designed to produce a report. If they were going to be used to produce a report either way, they preferred to produce the report without getting killed. The commanders who accepted these practices without examining them too closely were operating under similar pressures from a different direction. A commander whose unit sustained heavy casualties during a patrol was required to explain those casualties. He needed a clear justification for why the risk had been worth taking. If the patrol had been assigned to check a particular area and had done so and come back intact, the report was clean. If the patrol had gone into a hot zone and come back with 4 dead and nothing to show for it, the report became a problem. Over time, some commanders stopped pushing their units into the situations that would produce those problem reports. The result was a mutual accommodation between officers and men, in which the performance of the mission became more important than the mission itself. There was a specific geography to how this worked. The areas closest to forward operating bases, the areas most frequently patrolled, became the areas that appeared most frequently in reports as having been searched and cleared. The areas further out, the ones that required longer exposure to danger and that were harder to support with air cover or quick reaction forces, tended to appear in reports less frequently. They were the areas that got described as cleared when they had not been, or as inaccessible when they were not, or simply as low priority when they were anything but. The enemy understood this geography too. Movement patterns adapted. Infrastructure in the deep countryside, the tunnel networks and supply caches and command structures continued to function because the war's actual center of gravity was in places that the American military was systematically under-visiting. The tunnel systems deserve more attention than they usually receive in popular accounts of the war. They were not simply hiding places. They were functioning underground communities with medical facilities, weapons workshops, communication centers, and enough stored supplies to sustain operations for months. The Q-Chi Tunnel Complex, which ran beneath territory that American forces occupied at the surface level throughout much of the war, extended for hundreds of kilometers. American units operated on top of it for years. They knew it was there. They ran operations to clear it. Those operations cleared sections that were accessible and left the deeper sections intact. What the official record called pacified territory was in some cases territory where the surface had been secured while the underground remained active. The war existed in layers, and the layers the official record was tracking were not always the layers where the actual contest was taking place. The Strategic Hamlet Program, which was designed to concentrate rural populations in defended villages and cut off the insurgency from its civilian support base, produced one of the more complete illustrations of the gap between reported reality and operational reality. On paper, by the early 1960s, significant portions of South Vietnam's rural population had been relocated into strategic hamlets. The hamlets were counted, reported as functional, marked as secured. The numbers looked impressive. The field reality was that a substantial portion of those hamlets existed primarily as data points. Some had been built without adequate security infrastructure. Some had been forcibly populated with civilians who had no loyalty to the government in Saigon, and who actively provided support to the Viet Cong the moment American or South Vietnamese government forces were not present. Some had simply been abandoned or overrun, and the status in the reporting system had not been updated, because updating it to reflect failure would have required someone to file a report acknowledging failure. The bureaucratic resistance to filing reports that acknowledged failure was not a minor institutional quirk. It was a structural feature of how the war was managed, and it had consequences that compounded over years. Units that encountered problems they could not explain within the existing framework tended not to explain them at all. Reports were written around the problems. Language was chosen that made ambiguous outcomes sound more positive than they were. After-action reports, which were supposed to be honest accounting documents that allowed the military to learn from operations, became in many cases promotional documents, records of what the unit wished had happened or what the unit needed to have happened in order for its performance evaluation to look acceptable. The men who wrote these reports were not generally dishonest in their personal lives. They were operating within a system that had created specific incentives and specific punishments, and they were responding to those incentives and punishments the way most people respond to institutional pressure, by finding ways to give the institution what it said it wanted, while protecting themselves from the consequences of giving it something else. The tragedy was not that dishonest men had taken over the military reporting structure. The tragedy was that the structure had been built in such a way that honest reporting was punished and optimistic reporting was rewarded, and eventually the people inside the structure simply internalized the lesson and stopped noticing the gap. There were individuals who did not internalize the lesson, who continued to file honest reports, and who escalated concerns through whatever channels were available to them. Their fates within the institution are instructive. Some were reassigned to less desirable positions. Some found their assessments simply removed from the reporting chain, received at one level and not forwarded to the next. Some were encouraged, directly or indirectly, to revise their assessments in ways that aligned better with what the chain of command needed to hear. A small number continued anyway, and a smaller number still eventually found ways to bring their concerns to journalists or to congressional investigators. Those who did were often described, within the institutional culture of the military, not as honest men but as disloyal ones. The concept of loyalty as it functioned inside the American military in Vietnam is worth examining carefully. Loyalty in most institutional settings refers to a relationship between a person and a set of values or a mission or a larger community. In the Vietnam-era military, as in many institutions under pressure, loyalty had gradually come to refer primarily to a relationship between a person and his immediate superiors. You were loyal if you gave your superiors what they needed. You were disloyal if you gave them something accurate that made their position more difficult. The shift from the first kind of loyalty to the second is one of the more reliable indicators that an institution is in serious trouble, and it happened in the American military in Vietnam, with relatively little resistance and relatively little public acknowledgement until much later. The press, which played a complicated role throughout the war, was for a significant period of time working with information provided through official military channels that were already filtered through this distorted loyalty structure. The early years of American involvement, when the press corps in Saigon was small and access was generally provided through official escort, produced reporting that reflected the official optimism without always interrogating it. Reporters who relied on official briefings, which became known in the press corps as the 5 o'clock follies for their consistent disconnect from reported field reality, were receiving information that had already passed through multiple layers of institutional revision by the time it arrived at a microphone. The reporters who went into the field and worked from their own observation rather than from official briefings produced a different picture. They saw what soldiers saw, which was a war that did not move in a clear direction, that produced casualties and destruction without producing the measurable progress the official briefings described. The tension between what the field reporters were writing and what the official briefings were saying became one of the defining features of the war's public presentation, and it never resolved cleanly. The military's response to critical reporting was rarely to address the substance of the criticism. It was more often to question the reporters' access, their motives, their understanding of the larger picture. The implication was always that the reporters were missing something, that there was a strategic context that would make the field reality look different if they could see the whole board. The strategic context that was being invoked was itself largely a product of the same reporting structures that had produced the distorted body counts and the optimistic Hamlet assessments and the search and avoid patrols that were being written up as active engagements. Drug use among American forces in Vietnam has been documented extensively since the war, but its operational significance is less often examined honestly. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, drug use was not a marginal phenomenon affecting a small subset of soldiers. It was widespread enough to constitute a genuine readiness problem that the military was simultaneously trying to address through policy and trying to minimize through the same reporting structures that distorted everything else. The numbers on drug use that appeared in official reports were almost certainly lower than the actual prevalence, for the same reasons that other negative data points were systematically minimized. The soldiers who were using drugs heavily were doing so for reasons that were inseparable from the structural conditions of the war itself. The boredom of long static deployments, the absence of clear purpose, the disconnect between mission and meaning, and the specific kind of dread that comes from knowing that the danger you face is not organized around any comprehensible objective. Marijuana was the most common substance, and in the early years of escalation, its use was relatively contained. By the end of the 1960s, Heroin had become widely available in South Vietnam. It was cheap, it was potent, and it was present in a way that reflected the broader economy of the war, one in which enormous amounts of money and material and moral abstraction were flowing into a country whose institutional structures had been severely compromised by decades of conflict and colonial extraction. The same informal networks that sustained the insurgency also sustained the drug supply, and the two economies were sometimes literally the same economy. American soldiers were, in some documented cases, funding the operations of the forces they were fighting through the drug purchases they were making. The response of the military command to the drug problem tracked the same institutional logic that shaped everything else. Commanders who reported drug problems in their units were implicitly reporting on their own command climate. A unit with a serious drug problem was a unit whose commander had lost control of it, and losing control of your unit was the kind of thing that ended careers, so reports minimized. Soldiers who were obviously impaired were covered for by their comrades, who had their own reasons for not escalating the issue, and by officers who preferred to handle things informally rather than generate paperwork that would attract attention. The result was a command structure that had a very clear official position on drug use and very little operational ability to address the reality of it, partly because addressing the reality would have required acknowledging a scale of the problem that the official position had denied. The relationship between Black American soldiers and the war they were fighting deserves sustained attention that it rarely receives in mainstream accounts. Black Americans in the early years of the war died in disproportionate numbers. This was partly a function of how the draft operated, which consistently produced outcomes that reflected the structural inequalities of American civilian society. College deferments, which kept many white men out of combat service, were less available to black men who had had less access to higher education. The combat arms, the infantry and the airborne units, and the units most consistently assigned to the most dangerous operations, drew heavily from the populations that had the fewest alternatives. The military's own internal data, when it was examined honestly, showed that the burden of the war's most lethal work was being distributed in ways that corresponded to race, in ways the military's public communications consistently downplayed. Inside the military, racial tensions that had been building in American civilian society throughout the 1960s arrived in Vietnam with the soldiers who carried them. The civil rights movement, the urban uprisings, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, all of this was happening while soldiers were deployed, and it was happening to the families and communities they had left behind. For black soldiers, the distance between the stated purpose of the war and the lived experience of racism within the military and within American society created a specific kind of dissonance that was not adequately addressed by anything the military offered. Black soldiers who raised concerns about racial inequity within their units were frequently disciplined or dismissed rather than heard. The data on courts-martial and non-judicial punishment during the Vietnam era shows consistent racial disparities that the military's official history has acknowledged only partially and reluctantly. The fragging phenomenon, which refers to the use of fragmentation grenades to kill or wound officers or NCOs within a unit, is usually treated in popular accounts as a shocking anomaly, evidence of how badly the war had broken down. In reality, fragging was a more systematic response to a specific structural condition than that framing allows. It happened most frequently in units where the relationship between officers and enlisted men had completely broken down, where soldiers believed that their officers were making decisions that were reckless or self-serving, where the accountability mechanisms that were supposed to protect soldiers from incompetent or abusive leadership had failed, and where no legitimate channel for complaint or redress was available or trusted. The number of documented fragging incidents during the Vietnam War runs into the hundreds. The number of suspected fragging incidents that were reported as accidents or as enemy action is impossible to determine with precision, but credible estimates by military historians suggest it was substantially higher than the documented number. A certain percentage of the unexplained deaths that occurred in rear areas, away from active combat, were almost certainly internal. The military's approach to fragging was to prosecute the cases it could make and to reclassify the cases it could not. The underlying conditions that produced fragging, the specific combination of institutional breakdown and individual desperation that made killing your own officer seem like a rational response to your situation, were not addressed through policy in any sustained way. The Phoenix program, which operated between 1965 and 1972 and was designed to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong's political infrastructure, produced some of the most contested accounting in a war full of contested accounting. The program's stated mission was to capture or kill members of the shadow government that the Viet Cong maintained in South Vietnamese villages, the political organizers and tax collectors and intelligence operatives who sustained the insurgency at the local level. The program's actual operations were considerably more complicated. Local South Vietnamese officials and military officers who ran much of the program's operational work had their own interests, which did not always align cleanly with the program's stated objectives. Settling local scores, eliminating personal rivals, extracting money and resources from civilians who were accused of Viet Cong affiliation, all of these things occurred under the program's institutional umbrella. The number of individuals killed under the Phoenix program's formal accounting was reported in the tens of thousands. How many of those individuals were genuinely part of the Viet Cong infrastructure? How many were civilians accused on unreliable information? How many were victims of personal or political grievances dressed up as counterinsurgency? Is a question that the available evidence does not fully answer, and for which the program's institutional design made honest accounting extremely difficult. The treatment of prisoners and detainees by American and South Vietnamese forces has been documented extensively, and the gap between the official rules of engagement governing prisoner treatment and the reality of prisoner treatment in the field was one of the most consistent features of the war's operational landscape. The laws of war that governed prisoner treatment were known, were trained, and were regularly violated. Prisoners were killed during capture operations. Prisoners in custody were subjected to coercive interrogation that went well beyond what official doctrine permitted. South Vietnamese intelligence services operated detention and interrogation facilities whose methods were widely known to American advisors and officials and which received American resources and American coordination. The official response to documented violations followed a predictable pattern. Low-level actors were identified as responsible. Systemic factors were minimized or denied. The institutional environment that had produced the violations, the pressure to produce intelligence quickly, the absence of reliable oversight, the implicit or explicit tolerance of harsh methods by commanders who needed results and preferred not to ask detailed questions about how the results were obtained. That environment was described as exceptional rather than structural. My Lai, which became the most publicly known atrocity of the war, was treated in its aftermath primarily as an aberration, as something that had been committed by a specific set of individuals operating outside the norms of American military conduct. The evidence that emerged in subsequent investigations and memoirs and oral histories suggested something considerably less exceptional, suggested that the specific conditions that produced My Lai were present in various forms across the war, and that what made My Lai different was not that it happened but that it became known. The rotation system that governed American troop deployments in Vietnam, under which individual soldiers rotated through 12-month tours rather than units serving for the duration of a campaign, created specific operational and psychological conditions that shaped the war's character in ways that are still debated among military historians. The argument for the rotation system was straightforward. It distributed the burden of service more equitably, prevented the total physical and psychological destruction of units held in the field indefinitely, and maintained a pipeline of experienced soldiers moving through the force. The arguments against it were more complicated and took longer to become visible. Under the rotation system, a soldier who arrived in Vietnam began his tour knowing that his immediate personal objective was to survive 12 months. The war's objectives, which were already not clearly defined and not clearly achievable, became less relevant than the individual countdown. This created a specific psychological orientation toward risk. Early in the tour, soldiers were new to the environment and tended to take risks from inexperience. Late in the tour, soldiers who were close to their rotation date became extremely risk-averse, which had consequences for unit cohesion and tactical effectiveness that commanders struggled to manage. The middle period of the tour, when soldiers were experienced enough to be effective, but far enough from their rotation date not to be paralyzed by the countdown, was the period of maximum individual effectiveness. But units were not composed of soldiers who were all at the same point in their rotation cycle. At any given time, a unit had people in every phase of the cycle, and managing that diversity of orientation was a persistent challenge that the system itself had created. What the rotation system did to unit cohesion over time was arguably its most damaging long-term effect. In previous American wars, unit identity had been a primary source of the social bonds that sustained soldiers through difficult conditions. Men who had trained together and fought together, and who knew they would continue to fight together, developed attachments that provided both practical and psychological support. Under the rotation system, those attachments were continually disrupted. A soldier who arrived in a unit found himself among strangers. Some of those strangers would leave before he had learned their names. He himself would leave before the next group of arrivals had learned his. The unit as a social entity was essentially a revolving door, and the deep loyalties that would have organized soldiers' behavior in the absence of other motivating forces were simply not present in the same way. What replaced unit cohesion as the primary binding social force in many Vietnam-era units was the small group, the squad, or the fire team. The 5 or 8 or 10 men who were actually sleeping next to each other and eating with each other and walking into the same situations together. Those relationships were intense in the way that all relationships forged under extreme conditions tend to be intense. They were also, within the larger institutional structure of the war, essentially stateless. They operated according to their own internal logic, their own norms of acceptable and unacceptable behavior, their own definitions of loyalty and betrayal, and those internal norms were not always aligned with what the official record of the war described as happening. When a small group of soldiers decided collectively that a particular mission was not worth dying for, they sometimes found ways not to die for it. When a small group of soldiers decided that a particular individual, whether an officer or a local civilian or a prisoner, deserved a particular fate, they sometimes administered that fate with no external accountability. When a small group of soldiers found a way to make their difficult situation slightly more bearable, whether through drug use or through quiet insubordination or through 100 other forms of institutional withdrawal, they tended to protect each other in those accommodations rather than reporting them upward. The small group, not the chain of command, was where actual authority resided in many Vietnam-era units. The South Vietnamese military, which was the institution American forces were nominally supporting and whose performance was central to the entire strategic rationale for American involvement, was itself a deeply complicated entity that the official American narrative consistently described in terms that did not match its operational reality. There were South Vietnamese units that fought with genuine effectiveness and genuine commitment. There were South Vietnamese officers and soldiers who believed in what they were fighting for and who demonstrated that belief through years of service at substantial personal cost. The South Vietnamese military also contained, at all levels, individuals who were corrupt, individuals who were incompetent, individuals who were serving primarily for personal economic benefit, and individuals whose actual loyalties were ambiguous at best. American advisors who worked closely with South Vietnamese units were often acutely aware of these disparities. The reports they filed, when they were honest, described a force with serious structural problems that American training and equipment could not fully address because the problems were not primarily technical. They were institutional and political. A military that was embedded in a political system characterized by instability, corruption, and a deficit of popular legitimacy could not be trained into a functioning counterinsurgency force simply by improving its fire discipline or its logistical procedures. The political conditions that the military existed within were the conditions that determined its character. Those conditions were not within the authority or the capacity of American military advisors to change. But reporting that honestly would have required acknowledging that the fundamental strategic premise of the war was flawed in ways that could not be corrected through additional resources or additional time. So the reports often did not say this honestly. They described progress toward a goal of South Vietnamese military self-sufficiency that was always slightly further away than it had been the year before, always conditional on additional support that would allow the underlying structural problems to be resolved, always positioned just over the next horizon of training and equipment and political stabilization. The language of imminent sufficiency persisted through the entire American involvement in Vietnam. The South Vietnamese military's collapse in 1975, 2 years after the last American combat forces had withdrawn and 2 years after the Paris Peace Accords had declared the war essentially over, was described in retrospect as a failure of will. What it was, in large measure, was the final accounting for years of optimistic reporting that had described a military capacity that had never fully existed. The air war over Vietnam and over the neighboring countries of Laos and Cambodia presents its own archive of misrepresentation. The bombing campaigns were among the most intensive in the history of aerial warfare. The tonnage of ordnance dropped on Southeast Asia during the American involvement exceeded the total tonnage dropped in all theaters during the Second World War by a substantial margin. The official justifications for the bombing shifted as the war progressed, from interdiction of supply lines to destruction of enemy infrastructure to the coercive signaling of American resolve to Hanoi. Each justification was accompanied by assessments of its effectiveness that were, in the consistent pattern of the war, more optimistic than the evidence supported. The bombing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was the primary supply route for North Vietnamese forces and materials moving into the south, was an operational focus throughout most of the war. Enormous resources were devoted to it. The trail was bombed extensively and continuously. Intelligence assessments of the damage were produced regularly and regularly showed impressive destruction of vehicles and materiel. The trail continued to function throughout. It was not a fixed infrastructure that could be permanently destroyed by repeated strikes. It was a flexible, adaptive network that repaired, rerouted, and rebuilt faster than the bombing could destroy. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong logistics system that used the trail demonstrated an adaptability and resilience that was consistently underestimated in American planning and consistently described in terms that suggested near destruction was imminent, rather than that the approach was fundamentally not working. The secret bombing of Cambodia, which began in 1969 and continued for years without public acknowledgement, operated under its own separate distortion structure. The bombing was reported within internal military communications as if it were occurring in South Vietnam. Falsified records were filed. Radar operators were given incorrect coordinates. The administrative apparatus of the air war generated documentation that said one thing while the planes were doing another. The scale of this falsification was significant enough that, when it eventually became known, it contributed to the series of congressional hearings and legal proceedings that formed part of the broader institutional reckoning of the early 1970s. But the falsification itself had been a collaborative project involving enough people at enough levels of the military and civilian command structure that it could not be assigned to any single actor or any single decision. It was a systemic product, a natural extension of the same institutional culture that had learned to value favorable documentation over accurate documentation. The psychological cost of serving in Vietnam was documented with increasing seriousness in the years following the war, but it was dramatically under-acknowledged during the war itself. Combat stress reactions had been recognized as a military medical concern since at least the First World War. The Vietnam-era military had policies that addressed acute combat stress. What it was less equipped to address was the specific form of psychological damage that the war's structural conditions tended to produce, a damage that was not simply a reaction to the intensity of combat, but was more closely related to the specific disorientation of fighting in conditions where the rules changed without notice, where the enemy was indistinguishable from the civilian population, where the purpose of the mission could not be stated in terms that satisfied the person being asked to risk dying for it, and where the institutional structure that was supposed to provide meaning and accountability had become a primary source of confusion and distrust. Soldiers who were experiencing serious psychological symptoms in the field had limited options. Seeking medical attention for mental health concerns risked being labeled unreliable, which had career consequences and social consequences within the unit. The stigma around mental health in the mid-20th century military was substantial, and it operated in an environment where the social bonds of the small group were one of the only reliable sources of stability available to most soldiers. Removing yourself from that social context, even temporarily, even with good cause, was experienced by many soldiers as a form of abandonment. Some stayed in the field in states of psychological distress that were visible to everyone around them and that contributed to erratic or dangerous behavior that was managed informally within the small group without ever being reported upward or addressed clinically. The men who came home carried this with them in ways that the medical and social support systems of the late 1960s and early 1970s were not prepared to address. The condition that would eventually be formally recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder was not named as such until 1980, when it was formally included in the diagnostic classifications of the American Psychiatric Association. In the years between the end of major American involvement in Vietnam and that formal recognition, hundreds of thousands of veterans were living with symptoms that had no official name, and for which the Veterans Administration offered limited effective treatment. They were living inside a public narrative about the war that had no room for what they knew about it. The official version said misunderstanding. The veterans knew misrepresentation. The distance between those two things was exactly the distance between what the war had been on paper and what it had been on the ground. The intelligence failures of the Vietnam War were not simply failures of information collection or analysis. They were failures of institutional willingness to act on information that had been collected and analyzed, but that contradicted what the institutional structure needed to believe. The Tet Offensive of January 1968, in which North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched simultaneous attacks on more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam, including a brief assault on the American Embassy compound in Saigon, is the most dramatic single illustration of this pattern. The offensive had been anticipated by some analysts. Signals intelligence had suggested unusual enemy movement and coordination. Local intelligence in several areas had indicated preparations that were inconsistent with a defensive posture. These signals had not been synthesized into a coherent warning that reached operational commanders in time to affect preparations, and the dominant intelligence assessment had continued to project an enemy that was weakened and unable to mount significant offensive operations. After the offensive, the official American response was to describe it as a military defeat for the enemy. In purely tactical terms, there was support for this description. The Viet Cong suffered very heavy losses. Most of the positions they seized were retaken quickly. The popular uprising that the offensive's planners had hoped to trigger did not materialize, but the strategic impact of the offensive was the opposite of what a military defeat would normally produce. The American public, which had been told consistently that the enemy was being degraded and that the war was being won, had just watched simultaneous attacks across the entire country that the official assessments had not predicted. The gap between the official description of the war's progress and the visible reality of the Tet Offensive was too large to paper over. Public support for the war began a decline from which it never recovered, not because the public had suddenly understood the war better, but because the misrepresentation had finally become impossible to sustain against the evidence of their own eyes. The years between Tet and the final American withdrawal were characterized by a strange doubling in which the war continued at substantial cost in lives and resources, while the domestic political consensus for continuing it had dissolved. Soldiers deployed after 1968 went to a war that their country had functionally decided it did not want to fight anymore. They were implementing a policy that was being publicly argued against. That was the subject of enormous domestic controversy that their own government was actively negotiating to end, while simultaneously asking them to sustain the pressure that would make the negotiated outcome favorable. The psychological position of being asked to risk death for a policy that was already being wound down was not adequately acknowledged by the institutions that were doing the asking. Vietnamization, which was the policy framework adopted in the Nixon years to gradually transfer combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces while withdrawing American troops, was announced as a success at every stage of its implementation. American troop levels came down. South Vietnamese force levels went up. The metrics of Vietnamization showed the policy working according to plan. What the metrics showed less clearly was what the South Vietnamese military was doing with the combat responsibility it was absorbing, how reliably it was performing in contact, how sustainable its logistics and command structures were in the absence of American support, what the quality of the units being organized and trained actually was when measured against something other than their presence on the order of battle. The honest answers to those questions were available to people in a position to ask them. They did not move through the reporting structure efficiently, because efficient movement of those answers would have required acknowledging that the policy's fundamental premise, that South Vietnamese forces could be prepared to hold the country without American combat support, was not being validated by operational experience. The prisoners of war and the question of men listed as missing in action became one of the most charged dimensions of the war's long aftermath. American prisoners held in North Vietnam were subjected to treatment that ranged from harsh to brutal. The North Vietnamese prison system used American prisoners as political assets, extracted propaganda statements through coercive means, and managed the prisoners' condition in ways that reflected the larger political dynamics of the conflict. The code of conduct that governed American POW behavior, which required resistance to interrogation and refusal to make statements that could be used for propaganda, was applied in conditions that made compliance with it extraordinarily difficult, and soldiers who broke under those conditions returned home to complicated receptions that reflected the larger moral confusion of the war they had fought. The missing in action question extended well beyond those who were known to have been captured. Men who had gone down in aircraft over remote terrain, men who had disappeared in jungle operations, men whose deaths could not be confirmed through recovered remains. All of these cases generated a category of accounting uncertainty that outlasted the war by decades and that became, in the political culture of the decades that followed, a repository for a specific kind of grief and a specific kind of suspicion that the government had not told the full truth about who had been left behind. The debate over whether American prisoners remained alive in Vietnam after the official end of American involvement was never definitively settled in terms of evidence. What it reflected, accurately, was a population of veterans and families and Americans who had learned through experience not to trust official accounts of what the war had been and what had happened in it. The land itself bore the marks of the war in ways that persisted long after the political arguments about it had moved on. Agent Orange, which was the most widely used of the herbicide compounds deployed to defoliate jungle cover and destroy food crops that might support enemy forces, was applied across enormous areas of South Vietnam. The health effects on Vietnamese civilians who lived in defoliated areas, on American soldiers who handled the chemical and operated in areas where it had been used, and on subsequent generations born to people with significant exposures, were subjects of official denial and minimization for years after the war. The Dow Chemical Company and other manufacturers had internal documentation suggesting awareness of dioxin contamination in the herbicide before widespread military application. The military had its own internal assessments. The public record, through the 1970s and into the 1980s, was one of consistent institutional resistance to acknowledging the health consequences, a resistance that had the effect of delaying medical assistance to veterans whose illnesses were directly attributable to their exposure. The ordinance left behind in the soil of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia has killed and maimed civilians for every decade since the war ended. Unexploded cluster munitions and landmines and other ordnance continue to cause casualties. The saturation bombing of Laos, which was among the heaviest in the history of air power, left a country that the United States government had officially denied bombing for years, with a landscape still contaminated enough 50 years later to kill children who disturbed the wrong piece of ground. The clearance of that ordnance, which has been ongoing since the war, proceeds at a pace that will require generations to complete. The formal end of American military involvement in Vietnam, which is usually dated to the Paris Peace Accords of January 1973, did not end the war. It ended American participation in it. The war between North and South Vietnam continued. North Vietnamese forces, which had agreed under the accords to maintain their existing positions, began moving within months of the agreement's signing. South Vietnamese forces, deprived of American air support and operating on reduced American material assistance, found themselves in a deteriorating position. The American political system, consumed by Watergate and by the exhaustion of a decade of argument about Vietnam, was in no position to respond to the deterioration with anything that looked like renewed commitment. The fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975, was the final accounting. The American ambassador was evacuated by helicopter from the embassy roof. Thousands of South Vietnamese who had worked with American forces and the American civilian apparatus, people who had reasonable grounds to believe that their association with the American effort had made them targets, were left behind in the evacuation's chaos. The images from those final hours, the helicopter on the roof, the crowds outside the embassy gates, became some of the most reproduced images in the history of photojournalism, not because they were the most dramatic images of the war, but because they compressed the war's entire arc into a single legible frame. What those images did not capture, and what no single image could capture, was the 20-year accumulation of unreported reality that had preceded them. The body counts that had not reflected actual casualties, the Hamlet assessments that had not reflected actual pacification, the patrol reports that had not reflected actual movements, the intelligence estimates that had been revised to fit the preferred narrative rather than the available evidence. The soldiers who had understood what was happening and had found no institutional channel through which to communicate that understanding. The officers who had known and had chosen institutional survival over accurate reporting. The officials who had received accurate assessments and had set them aside. The journalists who had filed accurate stories and had been dismissed as lacking strategic perspective. None of that showed in the photograph of the helicopter. It was compressed into silence, the way most of what had actually happened in Vietnam was eventually compressed into silence. The veterans who knew the texture of what the official record had papered over found, in the years after the war, that the country was not especially interested in hearing the detailed version. There was appetite for the cinematic version, for the version that had dramatic arc and moral clarity and defined villains and something like resolution. The actual experience of the war, the corrosive ambiguity and the institutional dishonesty and the quiet personal accommodations that had kept the system running long after it had lost any legitimate purpose, was harder to organize into a form that audiences wanted to receive. The memorials came, eventually. The wall in Washington, with its 58,000 names in chronological order of death, provided something that was genuinely moving and genuinely appropriate. It did not explain what had killed those men, not in the sense of explaining the decisions and the distortions and the institutional incentive structures that had sent them to Vietnam and kept them there and sent their successors after them. It listed them. It provided a surface for grief. It did not provide an accounting. The accounting remained scattered across after-action reports that had been filed away in archives, across oral histories that had been recorded and were being slowly digitized and published, across memoirs by officers and soldiers who had decided, finally, late in their lives, that the version in the official record was not the version they could let stand as the only record. The accounting lived in the testimonies given to congressional investigators who had asked hard questions about body counts and pacification and the Phoenix program and the air war over Cambodia. It lived in the declassified documents that had been released in fragments through Freedom of Information requests, and in the reports of investigators who had, decades after the fact, gone back through the primary sources and found the distance between the official version and the operational reality to be larger and more systematic than even the war's harshest critics had originally claimed. The war was over in 1975. The accounting for it was not. The men who had served in it were aging by the time the most serious historical reassessments began to circulate. Some had been carrying their version of the war for 30 or 40 years before anyone asked them the specific questions that the official record had avoided. Some had reached the end of their lives without being asked at all. The knowledge of what the war had actually been, the operational reality that had been systematically removed from the reports as they moved upward through the chain of command, was distributed across memory and private correspondence and the internal records of units and commands that had not all been preserved. Some of it was simply gone. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in March 1973. The South Vietnamese government continued to receive American financial and material support. The war continued without American bodies in it. It continued through 1973 and through 1974 and into 1975. The South Vietnamese military continued to fight. The North Vietnamese and their southern allies continued to fight. People continued to die on both sides, in numbers that were not being counted by American systems anymore, in operations that were not being tracked in American after-action reports, in a war that was still happening without the institutional apparatus that had produced 2 decades of optimistic accounting. On April 29, 1975, the day before Saigon fell, the last official American operation in Vietnam was a helicopter evacuation. It ran through the night. It continued into the morning of April 30th. When the last helicopter lifted off, there were still people on the ground who had been promised evacuation and had not received it. The war had been, among other things, a sustained exercise in the distance between what was promised and what was delivered. That distance, present from the beginning of American involvement and present at the end of it, had never been adequately measured in any official document, and the silence around it had become, in the final hours of the American war in Vietnam, simply the last thing the helicopters left behind. The war in Vietnam officially ended for the United States in 1975. Veterans continued to die from its exposures for decades afterward. The ground in Laos continued to detonate. The paperwork, somewhere in a federal archive, still said what it had been written to say.